The wind scraped its long fingers across the cabin walls, rattling the shutters like a mourner knocking at the door. Inside, Elias Boone rocked his daughter in a creaking chair that had grown too familiar with sorrow. The fire had burned down to a fistful of embers, and the milk was long gone. Baby June's cries broke the silence like glass under boot. Sharp, endless, demanding. Elias whispered what comfort he could, but his voice cracked with every word. He had buried Annie just 2 weeks past, under the mound of red earth that still looked too raw to be real, and now the night pressed in on him with a weight he could not throw off. Grief was not an ache. It was a stone pressed into his ribs. Every time June's little mouth opened in hunger, Elias felt the stone grind deeper. He rocked her until his arms trembled, whispering, "I know, little one, I know." But a cowboy's calloused hand were made for rope and reins, not bottles and lullabies. Morning came pale and reluctant, the prairie stretching wide and lonesome under frost. Elias wrapped June in a threadbare blanket and trudged into town, shoulders hunched not from cold but from shame. Every step felt like dragging chains. At the general store, faces turned his way. Some pitted, others whispered. He caught words carried sharp on the wind. "Poor Boone. Man can rope cattle but can't keep his own alive." Another voice, female, low but cutting. "That baby won't last winter if he keeps to himself." Sheriff Cal Rourke tipped his hat in a stiff, obligatory way, but there was no warmth in it. The law didn't bend to a man's grief. Clara May Hollister, the widowed schoolteacher, stood on the boardwalk outside the Mercantile, her shawl wrapped tight. She noticed the hollowness in his eyes, though she did not step forward. Elias didn't meet her gaze. He kept walking, pride too brittle to bend into pleading. He left town empty-handed. No one offered food, no one offered milk, and he hadn't asked. Pride kept his tongue clamped behind his teeth. Back at the cabin, he boiled cornmeal into a thin gruel, trying to trick the child's hunger into silence. June spat it out, her tiny face twisted, cries stronger now, almost scolding. Elias's shoulders caved. He lifted her against his chest, rocking harder, his tears dripping onto her cheeks. "Forgive me, Annie," he whispered to the silence. "I can't give her what she needs." That night, he stumbled out into the yard, the stars cold above him. The prairie stretched endless, a black sea of grass. He lifted his face to it, as if heaven might answer. "Do you see her?" he asked the sky. "Do you see how hungry she is? Do you see how I'm failing her?" His voice cracked into the empty field. No answer came, only the low groan of winter wind rolling across the land. Back inside, June wailed again, frail body arching in her crib. Elias fell to his knees beside her, pressing his forehead to the wood rail. He whispered prayers half remembered from boyhood, bargaining, cursing, begging. He had driven cattle through dust storms, faced down men with revolvers on their hips, yet nothing made him feel as helpless as that infant cry. Then came a knock, soft, almost uncertain. He froze. Midnight, and no neighbor within miles. Another knock, gentle but steady. Elias rose, slow as a man walking into his own noose, and opened the door. Clara May stood there, shawl drawn around her shoulders, cheeks red from the cold. In her arms rested a woven basket, and in her other hand a small jug of goat's milk. The lantern light behind Elias flickered across her face, tired, lined with her own quiet grief, but steady as river stone. They didn't speak at first. The only sound was June's raw crying, clawing at the silence. Clara May's eyes moved past Elias, toward the child. Without waiting for invitation, she stepped forward, setting the basket on the table. Her movements were soft, measured, like someone walking through a church. She reached for June, her hands sure, practiced in a way Elias's never were. June quieted almost at once, her tiny fists unclenching as Clara May held the bottle to her lips. Elias stood there as if turned to stone. The sight undid him. Relief and humiliation tangled inside until he could hardly breathe. He wanted to say, "Thank you," but pride made the words heavy, stuck behind his teeth. Clara May didn't ask permission or explanation. She simply fed the child, humming low under her breath, a tune that was part lullaby, part prayer. Elias stared, heart thudding like hooves in a canyon. When June finally fell asleep, Clara May placed her gently back in the crib, smoothing the blanket with tender fingers. Then she looked at Elias, eyes steady, not pitying. "You'll need more tomorrow," she said quietly, her voice carrying the firmness of someone who had already lived through loss. Elias muttered, "I don't need charity." Clara May tilted her head, no anger in her expression, only calm. "It isn't charity. It's survival. And I know something about being left behind." The words cut deep. He wanted to push her away, to tell her he could manage, but the lie wouldn't form. Instead, he nodded once, stiff and wordless. The next day, she returned, and the next, each time with something: bread, wood broth, milk. Elias bristled, shoulders set hard against her kindness. But June took to Clara May like a flower turning to light. Her cries softened in her arms, her eyes heavy with trust. Elias watched, torn between relief and guilt that another woman could do what he could not. One afternoon, as Clara May stirred a pot of beans on the stove, Elias sat silent in the corner, June asleep on his chest. He heard voices outside, drifting through the thin cabin walls. Martha Kincaid and another woman passing by on their way to town. "Boone's already got another woman tending his baby," Martha hissed. "Ain't decent. Barely buried his wife, and he's let the schoolmar move in." The words slid under his skin like barbed wire. His first thought was to tell Clara May to leave, to protect her from talk that could ruin her reputation. Shame rose hot in his throat. But then June stirred against his chest, her tiny hand curling against his shirt. He looked at her, then at Clara May, steady at the stove, not flinching at the sound of gossip. Something in him bent, but did not break. He swallowed his pride, letting the gossip buzz outside like flies while inside. The baby slept, the fire burned, and Clara May stayed. And for the first time since Annie's death, Elias felt the faint tremor of trust, like the first warm wind slipping through the cracks of a long winter. Winter came down like a heavy quilt stitched with snow and silence. The land outside Elias Boone's cabin turned white, and the sky hung low as if pressing the world smaller, tighter, lonelier. Yet inside those walls, something was shifting. Clara May's visits no longer felt like intrusions. They stretched into hours, then evenings, until it became easier for Elias to imagine the cabin with her in it than without. She moved through his home with quiet grace, stacking wood by the hearth, mending small things that Elias had ignored: tears and blankets, a loose hinge on the cupboard, a draft under the door. These were small tasks, almost invisible, but together they stitched a fragile sense of life back into the cabin. Elias, who had once resisted her kindness, found himself performing small gestures in return. He noticed the lace on her boot had snapped, and without a word he fixed it with a strip of leather. She sewed the tear in his work shirt, her needle moving steadily as they sat by the fire in the soft hush of evening. Their conversations were simple, but in the silence between words something stirred, something gentler than grief, warmer than survival. Still, town talk ran sharp. Whenever Elias rode into town for supplies, he could feel the whispers. "She spends more time at Boone's than her own place. Widower and widow both. Ain't hard to guess what's brewing." Martha Kincaid's tongue wagged the loudest, her voice quick to catch any ear. Clara May, though, held her head high when she walked through the boardwalk, baby June in her arms. Her silence toward gossip was not submission, but defiance. Elias noticed, and the sight of her unbent posture gave him strength he hadn't known he carried. One night, as wind howled across the prairie, Elias stared at the fire, June asleep in her cradle. He said, almost to himself, "I don't know how to be both father and mother." His voice was hoarse, scraped by doubt. Clara May, seated across from him, lifted her gaze. "You don't have to be both," she answered softly. "You only have to be present." The words landed like water on dry earth. Elias's throat tightened, not from sorrow but from something loosening. He nodded, slow, taking in her truth. That night, he held June differently, less like a burden to keep alive, more like a gift to be cherished. When she giggled in her sleep, a rare sound, Elias smiled faintly. The stone inside him shifted, just enough to let in a flicker of light. But peace in the Wild West was never left untested. Sheriff Calrourke came by one evening, his boots heavy on the porch, his knock harder than necessary. Elias opened the door, his jaw already set. The sheriff's eyes flicked from him to Clara May, who stood at the hearth stirring a pot. "Evenin', Boone," the sheriff said, his tone neutral but edged. "I've been hearing talk. Folks saying the teacher's taken up residence here. Improper, some call it." Elias stiffened. Pride surged, ready to bark back. But Clara May stepped forward, her voice calm, steady. "If decency is letting a child starve when food can be given, then let them call me indecent." Her eyes didn't waver from the sheriff's. "You tell the town this. I stand here because it's right. That is all." Sheriff Rourke hesitated, then tipped his hat and left. Elias watched Clara May, awe softening his features. For the first time in weeks, he felt not ashamed but defended, as though grief had an ally. The true test came on a night when the storm outside howled like wolves across the prairie. Snow fell thick, swallowing the cabin in a white silence. Inside, June's small body burned with fever. Her cries were weak, her forehead hot as coals. Elias panicked, pacing the cabin, sweat cold on his brow. "Not her too. Lord, not her too." He rocked her, his voice breaking into desperate murmurs. He thought of Annie's grave beneath the frozen earth, the raw wound that had never closed. The fear of digging another mound tore through him like fire. Clara May took charge. She soaked cloths in cold water, pressing them to June's skin. She whispered lullabies, the same tune she had hummed weeks before. Elias knelt beside her, helpless, hands trembling. "I can't lose her," he whispered, forehead pressed against the cradle. "I can't lose both." Clara May's hand found his shoulder, steady as stone. "You won't. Not while breath is in us." The hours crawled. The storm beat the cabin, rattling windows, sealing the roads with drifts. Elias prayed aloud, his voice raw, to God, to Annie, to any spirit listening. Clara May held June close, rocking her against her chest, her lips brushing the baby's damp hair. And then, as dawn crept pale through the frost-covered window, June's fever broke. Her breathing steadied, soft and even, her small fist unclenched. Silence filled the room, not heavy this time, but holy. Elias sat back, tears streaking his weathered face. The morning light spilled across them, gilding Clara May's hair, turning the cabin into something almost sacred. He looked at Clara May, not as a woman who had saved him, not as a visitor, but as part of the fragile circle that was his family. The stone in his chest broke apart, replaced by something warmer, steadier. Weeks passed, and the storm of gossip in town didn't die, but Elias no longer bent under it. He walked into town one bright morning, Clara May beside him, baby June in her arms. Their steps were measured, unhurried. Whispers stirred, but the sight of them together spoke louder than any rumor. Elias carried himself differently now, not hunched with shame, but tall, steady, proud. Sheriff Rourke tipped his hat, not out of duty this time, but respect. Martha Kincaid opened her mouth, but no words came. Something in the quiet dignity of that little family silenced her tongue. Back at the cabin, Elias watched Clara May laugh softly as June reached for her hair. He felt Annie's absence, yes, but not as a hollow anymore. It had become a space where new light could enter. Grief had not left him. It had changed him, softened his edges, taught him to bend without breaking. That night, with June asleep and Clara May sitting by the fire, Elias finally allowed himself to exhale. The cabin no longer echoed with emptiness. It pulsed with life, small and fragile, but steady. He realized survival had turned into something more, and as the fire burned low, Elias's thoughts turned outward, as though speaking to some unseen listener, some soul in need of hearing. "When the world calls you weak for needing help, remember this," he whispered. "Sometimes survival is not in standing alone, but in letting another hand steady the weight. Love doesn't always return as thunder or fire. Sometimes it comes as a knock at the door in the quiet night, carrying a basket of food and the courage to stay."